so excited about today's laser because we have two artists that have come up from Albuquerque and one coming down from Milwaukee. So spreading our out.
I'm from
you're Milwaukee. You're
Villanueva.
Okay.
It's towards Las Vegas.
Villanueva. Towards Las Vegas. Oh, good. Cool.
You're from Villanueva.
So I think everybody here knows me, so I'm not going to introduce myself. And knows about Zuvya Santa Fe and is on our mailing list, and knows that we have wonderful support from Santa Fe Art Institute and the NEA and New Mexico Arts, or we did have from the NEA, let's say that. Everybody knows that our next event is going to be Friday, May 23rd at the Chaco Visitor Center. We're going to be hosting Agnes Chavez and her Space Messengers Project and astrophysicist Julia Bluebird, works for NASA and the VLA. That's going to happen at the Chaco Visitor Center 30 minutes before sundown. So that should be pretty exciting, and it'll happen right before a star party. So if you want to stay there, and if you are interested in staying there, I can connect you with Agnes, who's reserved the group campground.
Oh, so you have to
Camping, or you could find somewhere to stay, like in Cuba overnight.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of other places, or you could go up to Farmington.
Well, we looked it up today.
Yeah.
And it's 3.5 hours.
Yeah.
And so then you're there, and then everything's dark, and it's like, time to go home.
So, yes, and then you rush back home because on Saturday, the 24th, we're having our salon from 4 to 6, and it's going to be a potluck. So bring a dish to share and a serving spoon. I'm not putting this out on our full mailing list, but invite friends, and we'll have kind of a nice party for the closing weekend. And then the final day of the exhibition is a closing laser, again with Agnes Chavez and Julia Bluebird. So if you don't get up to Chaco to see them, you can see them here at 6:30 on Sunday, May 25th. And also with Nancy Conrad of the Conrad Foundation. She's the wife of an astronaut who actually walked on the moon. So that's pretty exciting. Yeah. But tonight.
Question, do we what about plates for the potluck?
I brought some plates, but I'm sure we can always use more and stuff. And I got these compostable forks, knives, and spoons, and they're kind of really weird. So if you have plastic forks, knives, and spoons that you want to contribute, it might be good.
And is that going to be here?
It'll be here. We're going to set up a couple tables, and probably just these tables. Okay, so tonight, Flux and Feedback with Zuvya Sevilla, Kirsten Angerbauer, and Alyce Santoro in that order. I'm not going to take any more time away from them, and I'm just going to hand it over to Zuvya.
Hey everybody, if you don't know me, I'm Zuvya Sevilla. Thank you, Andrea, and everybody that made this show possible. It's really cool to be able to show with so many different artists, so many different sorts of work. And
thank you to John, by the way. John is a board member of Zuvya Santa Fe and has been behind the scenes.
Behind the camera over there.
And in many different ways, and wonderful Susan Latham, who needs no introduction, and fantastic Paul Biaggi, whose work is back there, and Wendy and Earl and Heather, who've been part of our group, and Mary Ann, artist whose work is there, and
There's more names than people.
awesome Marco. Yeah. Okay.
I can't see them all.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. And Susan's sculpture is the red sculpture right here, which we are so proud to be able to display in this wonderful space.
I've never exhibited on the floor before, so it's been quite an adjustment. But I look at them as a happy family, and indeed, this smile is one of the great masterpieces.
That's true, yeah. Happy.
Let's give a hands up for Violet.
happy to be on the floor with you here in the show. I have that floor piece over there in the corner. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I have that floor piece over there, which I also haven't done a floor piece yet. This is my first one. And then I also did the light boxes that are out in the hallway up there. So I consider myself a new media sculpture artist. I work a lot with computers. My work generally comes off as like really academic. I interface a lot with anything that you could really consider technology, whether that's a computer, a microcontroller, fire, the simple element of heat. Most people assume that when I was going through school or just like in any sort of academic setting, I generally excelled because of the fact that my work is very science connected, science oriented. But the truth is that even starting in like middle school, I always had a lot of trouble approaching science in like the curricular way, in the way that it's normally taught at you. I was always interested, like I'm covered in space tattoos. From a young age, I was always interested in space and outer space and all these different things. But when the moment came to actually encounter that in the classroom, I got lost because it was like, oh, space is all math? Who knew that was a thing? Once the moment came to actually do like the work, the mathematical work that goes into proving all these sort of different things, I started to get lost, started to like lose interest in that. And that's also when I started to get into art, just like normal painting and drawing, like the basics of what we would call art. Eventually, at some point, I realized that there's no reason why I can't use my art practice as a like inquisitive way where I can reapproach these topics that at some point I was really scared of, at some point I was really like just not drawn towards or even like pushed away from them, and use my art practice as like this auto-inquiry, this autodidactic thing where now I have the power to approach these really hard topics in a way that makes sense to me, and in a way that then hopefully makes sense to other people, in a way that I can display them in the gallery and inspire others. And so I started to go back to the beginning, like literally like 5th grade. I looked up the textbooks that I used in 5th grade and 6th grade and high school, and I started going through them and being like, do I understand this? Can I do 5th grade math? I cannot do 5th grade math. Do I actually understand like the topics that are trying to be like taught to me? And also, are those topics actually interesting to me? So I started going back down to basics. I like simplifying everything. I like keeping it at like foundational level. And so these, what you're seeing right now, are some gravity simulations inspired by like the very, very simple system of rules where you have a couple different little bodies in space that are emitting, that they have their own mass, they have their own gravity field, and then you're introducing this sort of like dust into the system. These are just made with Unity, which is like a video game engine. The point being that it's a very generative system. I can just tweak little rules here and there and have very different sort of results for this environment that I'm creating. Everything here was on the computer, but my goal is generally to push everything into the actual physical realm. I like to think, I like to think about the word visceral. I like to think about my practice as this dissection of something that's visceral. Dissection meaning the breakdown of something into parts, usually for the purpose of actually understanding what each of those parts do. And then the visceral being something that's within us, literally relating to the gut, something that we feel within us, and then just playing with these rules that come from everything. So in this case, I took all those different little solar system, proto-solar system videos, and made this really big installation where I bought 200 computer monitors and kind of spread them out in a parking garage, trying to come up with this like observation station where we can look at it and watch all these theoretical little like solar system and planets that could happen based on just simple physical laws. This was for a COVID era show, so it was in a parking garage, and instead of kind of walking by the pieces, people would actually like drive through the parking garage and see the pieces through their cars, which was really cool. I lugged around the screens across state lines when I moved to New Mexico, and I've just kind of been carrying these around, trying to come up with the different physical like manifestations and orientations and sculptural manifestations of putting these screens together. So this was a big 8-channel, 14-foot tall, 64 screens, big like cyclone dust simulation for currents a couple years ago in 2022, I think. But then also you can scale them a lot, scale them down a whole lot, and make something that can just go into the corner of a room. And playing around with different ideas of like different starting points with the rules, and getting everything from like really, really slow kind of explosions and dust to something that's really, really controlled, and becomes this live visualization of forces that are happening here. So in this case, in this little simulation, I think I've got like 3 bodies that are rotating around each other, and then one body is emitting this like particle stream. Each of the 3 bodies have their own mass, right? They have their own rules that are affecting them. But the interaction between them wouldn't be as obvious if this like stream of dust wasn't there. That's what's really revealing all these like movements and dynamics, and you end up with these really like intricate patterns from really, really simple rules. So that's kind of what I try to like start everything with. In thinking about gravity, I started thinking about lights and thinking about the way that lights, we think about it as this like thing that exists in space, right? We have all these light bulbs in the room, we have the window that's letting in all the sunlight, but it's this continuous ongoing process. It's an active thing that's happening throughout space. So going back to this picture from earlier, that is a theater spot going through a lens that I 3D printed, I think, and then kind of illuminating me through a long exposure. The light starts at the theater spot, right? It goes through a lens, and then eventually it makes an image at some point whenever the light gets captured. But that whole path of light, at some point I use the metaphor of like, it's a faucet of light, and people really like that. Whenever you turn the light on, that light is, those photons are constantly streaming. It's a movement that's happening until you block it or until you just turn it off, right? So going back to like the digital side, I started to think about light within a digital space and kind of recreating the same rules that light follows in our visual space, but setting up an environment in the computer. In this case, I'm using Blender, and I'm using a rendering engine that actually like redoes the same sort of ray tracing math that light does, but in the computer to a certain extent, right? But it is mimicking that same behavior of light, where it's having to travel across space. It's having to be edited by a lens or a shadow or something within that world, and then making something different out the other side. Being inspired by gravitational wave data, especially from different observatories that just kind of let people have their information, right? I started to think about how these gravitational waves that are happening in space are morphing space-time, right? And whenever light goes through them, that also starts to get lens. You get a gravitational lens. So I was like, why don't you take that information and literally form a lens out of it within the digital space, and then shine light through it and see what happens, see what it's like for that information to now sculpt and mold light. In this case, it's still a simulation, but I was able to start to take multiple instances of this light, which is just like a sine wave, right? Once you start to really simplify it a lot, stack them up within kind of like a digital optical bench, shine light through them, and start to get all these different images. Like the particles, it becomes this generative system. It becomes this rule-based environment where little tweaks start to like affect the image in very different ways. So starting with just one instance of this gravity wave, you can start to combine them, you can start to stack them. And slowly you start to combine these different data sets, and you get this moire effect where like a collection of very simple patterns start to overlap, start to edit themselves, and you get these like really, really rich and vibrant and very different sort of effects through a digital space. And it's digital, so as long as you're stuck inside during COVID and you don't care what your computer's doing and it's just rendering for weeks on end, you can animate it out. You start to encounter all these different like quirks of the system that, again, it's trying to do as much math that matches real life as it can, but it's still limited at some point, right? So you get all these different things regarding like the polygons of the files of like the lenses that I'm using. But you can really start to push different effects within the simulation and push different features of the light that's like being edited. And so you end up with just like a nearly infinite amount of different variations of these images. And because it's a computer render, again, you can just let it go for as long as you want, and you end up with like super highly dramatic, super detailed. So this is like the middle of that image, but just by itself, it could be its own print. When the time came to actually print them and display them, I had been staring at them through a computer screen for so long that just doing a normal print did not feel like enough. And so I got them printed on a transparency onto acrylic, and then I built a light box behind it so that the light of the image would come through the image itself as opposed to being bounced off and reflected. Very, very little detail, but it really made it feel like I was looking at these like digital renders. And yeah, I've made a couple different sizes. Most of the ones that I've made are actually on display here. But ultimately the goal is to remake half these patterns and just have them out on the wall, not just have them be a simulation, but actually make that optical bench back in real life, make those lenses in real life and see if I can get this sort of like diversity in image making, but out at the wall. And I've done a few tests, so this was like a very quick test that I made using just like one lens back in 2022. But then last year for a show I had at the Hardwood, I was actually able to make like a whole assembly, a whole build out of lenses that are 3D printed, have a source of light behind them, and then I have a Fresnel lens right at the front that's actually focusing. What am I doing? That's actually focusing the image from the lenses and projecting it out of the wall. It's actually actively modifying the light that's coming from the spotlight and morphing it, sculpting it as it goes through the air, and making an image out on the other end of the wall. So like I said, these are 3D printed. The idea being that I could take the actual files that I was using in all those renders and simulations and just export it straight out. I'm using just like a resin printer, using some clear resin, and then just polish them up to where they look clear when they come off the printer, but they always need some sort of post-processing. So there is what I call corporeal light assembly, which is the simulated light assembly, which are the light boxes, in relation with one of the light boxes down at the Hardwood Center in Albuquerque. In thinking about light and how light works and how light exists throughout space and how light actually makes our perception possible, right? We're able to see each other because we have the ability to see a very specific source of the EM spectrum, and that's what facilitates our view. I started to think about light sources, the origin of the light, right? And also thinking about different sorts of light. This is a chart of the EM spectrum. The source for this is the Center for Disease Control. It is pretty old, so I think it's still accurate. We don't have to worry about that or anything. But as you can see, we can see like a small fraction of the entire spectrum. Right? And whenever we make light-based work or light fixtures, we're sort of like focusing it for that small section. But I wanted to start working outside of that and started to think what would work for different sections of the spectrum actually look like. Ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays get kind of dangerous, so I haven't really worked on that sort of stuff, but if you guys know anyone, please let me know. Visible spectrum, I'm done. Infrared is the one that actually caught my attention the most because it's the closest to what we can see, but it's also a lot bigger in terms of like what we think of like the infrared sound. There's near infrared, which we can see with mildly modified like DSLR cameras, and then there's far infrared, which ends up being thermal imaging. So I started to think about using thermal imaging and using sources of heat as this source of light. And so I started working on this series of sculpture installations. This is what the piece down on the floor is part of. I call them sinks. They're very simple. They are sheets of metal with heaters and coolers attached to them. So this was the very first one at the Kearns Gallery a few years ago. It's a sheet of metal just hanging from the ceiling, and then behind it, there are 2 little electric heaters. And throughout the day, using like an Arduino, the heaters turn on, they turn off, they build up heat, they diffuse the heat through the material, and then using a thermal camera and a projector, we're actually able to view those movements of energy through visible light. This is a movement of energy that happens just beyond our perception, right? We can't see it going on, but you can feel it. You can put your hand up to the metal and feel that heat coming off of the material. It's also a very specific way of moving energy from the source, from the magical port in the wall that we plug our electronics in. The art piece plugs into that, it generates energy and pushes that out into the environment. Here's a quick like thermal view of the back of one of the panels. You can see a couple like hot spots. The heaters have just turned on in this instance, and then after time, that heat builds up and starts to diffuse through the material. And so you end up with these very vibrant, like simple geometric sculptures that once you add that projection mapping back on, you have these like very vibrant swaths of color that are this transposition, this like translation of light, where the thermal camera is taking in infrared light, the computer is processing that, and then the projector is reprojecting it back out as a visible light that we can see. In this case, I'm generally using these very like heavy duty, kind of intimidating, Chinese, very cheap thermal security cameras, because that's the cheapest way to get into thermal imaging. It's a very niche sort of technology. It's very expensive to get into just because not a lot of people use it. If you start to get too much into it, the military starts to get involved because it's the basics. It's the basic of a lot of different like military technology. But it's also the only thing that's able to make these movements visible. So this installation right here was for Currents last summer. These are the exact same panels that are on the floor down there, and this is a very similar pattern of heat and cold that's happening to those panels. Even though we can't see it, this is sort of like what that movement that's happening across the panels is seen like. And you guys are also welcome to touch these panels here if you want to reach down and touch softly. Of course, the implication of having a thermal camera in front of the piece is that as soon as you are in front of it, you also get projected onto it, right? You also start to have your presence, whether or not you're touching the piece. The fact that we ourselves are light fixtures for infrared heat lights makes us visible in this situation. And so it's very like flexible, very versatile. I've done a lot of different configurations. In this case, I'm using like corrugated steel with some powder coating baking lamps that were just like very high power heat, kind of water falling onto the material. Here's the same one from earlier, showing like as soon as you get in, whether or not you're touching it, you're still going to be projected onto it. And of course, the moment that you touch it, it's going to feel warm, it's going to feel cold, and that means that either you're receiving energy from the piece or you're giving your energy into the piece. But it's all still part of the never-ending movement of entropy and heat death of the universe that's just happening. But of course, we, within our environments, become these light fixtures. We're constantly emitting heat out, never to see it again. And so in having access to thermal cameras and thermal imaging, I started to like just see a lot of my surroundings a lot differently. I started carrying it around, kind of treating it like street photography. Thinking, of course, of like the implications of having military grade viewing technology in my hands at all time, but also starting to see what like different things that I thought I might know, like the sky and power lines up, above my studio. And seeing with different people in different conditions and different crowds. And again, keeping in mind that very heavy implication of what it is that I have, what it is that I'm using. And trying to highlight it in a different way that's not as pessimistic as like the border guard using it to hunt down immigrants. I'm trying to use it for art here, at least somewhat. Here is a power plant outside of Fort Worth, Texas, that has these Bitcoin miners right outside that are, again, cooling down these massive computers and making these movements of heat out into the environment. I actually have a collection of all this like thermal photography up at a show down in Albuquerque right now. If you go to 516 Arts in downtown Albuquerque, I have a big like 20-foot wall of about like a year's worth of photography with all this other stuff. Moving away from energy a little bit, the next thing that has been interesting me is the idea of like information and absorbing information and reading information, especially from the environment, and thinking about how computers tend to think about numbers and data a lot differently than we humans start to think about it, right? So this is a visualizer that I had in the Albuquerque City Hall last year that displays, the top bar displays the heat, like temperature in the room, and then the bottom bar displays the light levels in the room. But instead of displaying it as just like a straightforward number, like 68 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that, what I'm doing here is that I'm actually going into like the literal brain of the sensors that I'm using and pulling out the very direct like ones and zeros that the sensor is reading as temperature in the environment. But after that, it has to go through a bunch of math, a bunch of like, noise reduction, a bunch of different other operations before it can actually come out into a usable number for us humans. But I wanted to skip all that and just keep it in this very like random kind of lights blinking on the front of your computer case sort of pattern that makes no sense to us, but to the computer that's everything that makes sense to it. And so now something that's static, like the temperature in the room, becomes this really vibrant and like dynamic light animation that's just a little bit more exciting for people to see, especially in terms of like public art. But really trying to play with that idea of like the line in between the digital and the visceral. At one point, does the information about our environment go from being a part of our world to being a reading that's part of the computer, and then thinking about the in and outs of computers and how we deal with them. The last thing that I'll talk about, because this is actually a collaboration with Kirsten, this is a public art sculpture that we just did for downtown Albuquerque, part of their City Brights 2 project, where they wanted to make this, have a lot of light art along Central to just, bring a lot of like light and color to the space. So we worked on this big aluminum frame, laced it with this metallic material, and then lit it from the bottom. Lit it from the bottom with a bunch of different lights. We made it using, like I said, aluminum piping, a lot of 3D printed joints to connect everything. And then at the very base of the sculpture by the lights, there is a suite of sensors that is reading the temperature, the humidity, the noise levels, the light levels, and I should have put wind levels because it was really windy last few months. But it's reading all this information from the street where it's situated, and then based off that, that is what's driving the lights. Again, it doesn't necessarily make sense. It's not like a straightforward conversion from the humidity is this, so it's gonna look like this, but it's more about taking advantage about all the conversions that the computer's having to do, and just using this to make like more vibrant and exciting behaviors that are always happening within the computer itself, even if we don't always see them. So it looks a lot different now. It's like I said, the wind really took a beating to it, but this sculpture will be up until the end of next week, right? Yeah, we're taking it out on Friday, so if you're in Albuquerque, stop by and see it, especially during the night. But yeah, that's about it. There's a picture of the first sync test that I did, showing my hand and kind of like leaving behind that energy behind, and then taking it back out from the sculpture. So there's my website and email if you have any contact or you have any questions. Am I taking questions now or?
Let's wait till the end.
Okay, we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Hi everybody, my name is Kirsten Angerbauer, and I'll start off by just saying, just like you did, thank you so much to Andrea and SciArt Santa Fe, and also the Santa Fe Arts Institute, and everybody who helped get this opportunity together. I'm super excited to be able to chat with you guys today and share a little bit about my practice. So I'll introduce myself first. I am an artist. I would say I'm a designer. I'm also an interdisciplinary creative person. I like to make lots of things, whether that's art or furniture. I've gotten into video editing recently. I'm just kind of a multi-creative, and I like to get my hands on everything. Right now I work as the Fab Lab coordinator at the UNM School of Architecture and Planning, so we actually met each other back in undergrad, and we both worked in a Fab Lab at the University of North Texas, and now I run a Fab Lab. So it's been a full circle kind of journey from Denton to Albuquerque, which is where I'm now based. My art practice includes public art installations. I've done some large-scale steel sculptures. I have an interest in sound art and sound installations and using vibrations from sonic frequency to activate materials and enter into this sculptural and experience-based realm. And some themes that I've explored in my work include sensory experience and how we kind of take in the world through our bodies and our senses. I've also looked into queer identity personally growing up in the Mormon church and how that's kind of shaped how I view the world and like systems of power and just all of the crazy things happening now. And I have, like I said, been working with translating energy into physical objects. And so in today's talk, I'm gonna go a little bit behind the scenes and show you guys like how I started from just like scrappy experiments in my studio during also the COVID pandemic. That was a time that, you know, when it was locked down especially, I had to just, I kind of reset my thinking in terms of my art practice. I had been very much on this track of like public art and I'm gonna get the next big kind of I don't know, festival or temporary opportunity and kind of just keep chasing that next big thing. And when COVID hit, it was kind of like, well, there's no big public art grants happening anytime soon. So I'm gonna kind of just go inside and go into my studio and start playing around with things that interest me. So back in art school, I had been introduced to sound art through the UNT New Media department, and I took a course on sound art taught by Martin Back. And that's where I got introduced to like a lot of my initial just kind of understanding of what sound art even was. And so over the pandemic, I started researching this piece, Alvin Lucier, Music on a Long Thin Wire. And for those of y'all who don't know what that is, basically it's an installation where a wire is stretched across like a room or a volume. It's been installed in like lots of places over the years, but usually it's kind of a vast cavernous space. And then there's a sine wave frequency that's like clipped onto each end of this wire, and a sound frequency is kind of powered through the wire. And it's hooked up with an amplifier and a little pickup microphone, kind of like on a guitar, and then there's a little U magnet that the wire kind of travels between that helps amplify the vibrations. And so essentially what this piece does is, depending on the conditions of the space that it's in, it picks up like the bodies and the humidity and the condition of the air, and in turn it vibrates with a frequency and with sounds that match those environmental conditions. So I recreated this piece in my yard, in my studio during the pandemic, and it was just kind of out of curiosity. Like I was bored and I was like, well, maybe I can learn more about the sound art stuff if I just make some sound art. And I made this piece, or the replica of this piece. And yeah, the setup was exactly like I just described. So yeah, the amplifier and the power source, and then the frequency input kind of in the middle, and that split off to 2 speaker wires, which were clipped to the long wire. And then that's the contact microphone in the middle that would pick up the sound and then force it back out to the speaker so you could hear it. And here's just a little bit of what that sounds like. It's not extremely loud coming off the computer.
Maybe you can put the mic on for your speaker.
I think not all the way. But yeah, so basically, depending on where I located the piece, even in my yard, it would produce a vastly different sound. So that was kind of this open air setup. And in this one, I set it up in my metal shop, which is kind of under this enclosed like metal roof. And then even like starting to play with the wire and starting to like use it like a big instrument. It was super interesting and exciting to me. And essentially that experiment this idea kind of hit me. I was like, if I could run this frequency through the wire, like the Albuquerque piece, what if I just started running a sonic frequency through like anything? So I started, and this is what really started my, I would say, the experimentation phase of my sound art. So this is just one example, and I'm gonna take you through like just a quick reel of different things that I experimented with. And so I was looking at a couple things, sorry, let me back up. So some tools and equipment that I used to make this possible was, the first thing I did was go to like thrift stores, and I would go get like all these 2000 surround sound speaker sets for like $20 for like 7 nice speakers. And I'd take all those to my studio, take them apart, and just get the actual speaker body out. I also use power amplifiers, function generator app on my iPhone. So to generate the sine waves, I just used an app, which was super easy to like move some sliders around and adjust that frequency. And then I also used like a series of infrastructure that would kind of hold the materials, whatever that may be. So I had trays for like sand and water and particles, but I also had like dowels and little grid structures to hold things that were more like sheets or string or tape. And so my mind just was kind of like all over the place. It was like a super manic couple of months. So I was just like, what is gonna be the right setup for the right piece? And then what's actually gonna be interesting versus what's just kind of, okay, you know, you can tell that thing's vibrating, but it's not really creating that much of an effect. And I wanted to kind of merge those two things, where the material and the frequency that I was putting through it, and then also this visual effect. All of that kind of had to be exciting to me in order to push it maybe to the next level where it would become a piece. So this is an example of playing with these wire sticks on a vibrating tray. And I thought, like, how cool would it be if I could get the sticks to like go on these little journeys through like pathways that I cut into the acrylic. So this has never been realized yet. I'm hoping to one day, it's realized here. But in like a full kind of installation or piece, this one's kind of on the back burner, and a lot of these are. A lot of these I've never really done anything with, but a lot of them I have. So this was one of the original like water inspirations and experiments, and this was the starting point for the piece you see on the floor here, called Pools. And the addition of like dyes and lights and different add-ins into the water started to do a lot of interesting things to the frequency. Also the depth of water, the size of tray, like whether it's metal or plastic, and then just playing with the volume, playing with those frequency sliders. I found I could get like so many different shapes into the surface of the water by just adjusting all those variables. This was an exciting one that, again, something that I would love to make into a larger scale work. And this was black abrasive sand. It's like a sandblasting media. And so with the introduction of the vibrations, it started to act almost like this, I don't know, moving sand in the desert, like these little hills and valleys emerged, and they would start moving around. And again, depending on the frequency, I could get this to behave in different ways. The one downfall of this experiment is potential respiratory problems from inhaling particulates. So I'll have to workshop that one for safety reasons. I'm big on safety, run a Fab Lab, so I have to be. Another one that was exciting and has kind of gone through a couple iterations was throwing low frequency vibrations through foil. So this original setup, I literally used 2 clothes hangers, and they were attached to speakers using threaded rod, and then I just stretched that piece of foil. To me, it sounded like really bright, almost like oceanic sounds, but to some of my friends and people who dropped by the studio and saw it, they were like, this sounds like, I don't like it. Like, it makes me anxious. It doesn't really, you know, I don't hear the ocean, I hear anxiety. And so that's something that has been emerging as an interesting thing to explore with these works, is like, what is that emotional maybe reaction or that physiological reaction that somebody has? It totally goes back to you talking about the visceral. It's like, how do people resonate with the work? What is the resonant frequency kind of being presented? And how does that maybe relate to the resonant frequency of the self is something I like to think a lot about. I should read more, I'm not as smart as Zuvya with like the actual math and science, but my whole kind of process is just to research and try and just kind of go in a loop like that. Go on YouTube, find somebody who's done something similar, read forums, you know, get the information, and just try it until it works. And a lot of times it doesn't work for many, many, many tries. That's life. So here is another experiment using water and, oops. See if it'll play it. Water and tempera paint. It doesn't want to play it. But this one was super interesting because once the liquid got thicker, these little balls started to emerge on the surface of the liquid once the vibrations were introduced. And so again, this is another kind of spark, another question mark as to like, how do I maybe get that condition to sustain over time in an actual gallery piece? Oh, there it goes. So yeah, this super interesting phenomenon was happening, and eventually they would just kind of roll and fall back into the water. And to be honest, I should have taken more detailed notes because I do not remember exactly like what was in that tray, what the exact ratios were. It was dark, I had been at it for hours. And then it was like, oh, this is a moment, you know, here's that breakthrough moment. And speaking of breakthrough moments, I had a breakthrough moment when I started to play with these string-like materials. This should have probably been my first try after the wire experiment, but it took me a while to get to this idea. Like, what if I start, you know, just tying things onto the speaker and seeing what happens? And in this instance, like, I realized, like, whoa, like the actual waveform is starting to emerge through the string, especially through this lightweight, really stretchy material. And this is something that can totally like be captured. And I was super, super excited by this, especially when I put 4 together. I was like, hell yeah, like this is, you know, this is the moment to take bigger and take into like a real installation. And so that's what I did. I designed this piece called Pink Noise. This is just some process shots of me welding up some of the components. So this is one of the base pieces, and that's what held all the speakers and like wiring, and you know, similar to the pools, like I always put a steel box around it. I like welding, I had to put some welding in there. And then here is just more photos of that structure going together. This grid is made out of laser cut basswood shapes, and it was really important that like the spacing of each tape was the same all the way around, so there weren't like visual differences once it became a big mass. This is an assembly drawing for how this piece goes together. So you kind of see this exploded view over here where there's a speaker underneath each grid, and that's attached to the basswood grid with a little threaded rod. And essentially, I haven't tested this, but in theory, the piece could be as tall as you could make it as long as the speakers are powered and powerful enough. So here's a couple install shots of the very first time I put this piece together. I've actually since been able to show this piece at Currents in 2021, 2022. And Zuvya was incredible and introduced me to Currents, and I was able to show there. And so yeah, here's the finished piece in its first version. The second version was like a little taller, a little more zipped up, but essentially the same piece. And here's a little video of how the piece kind of worked in this setting. So I was really happy with it, and again, this was one of those ones that some people would come up and just really be like, I feel so peaceful around this piece. And you know, other people, it was kind of the opposite. They didn't want to really get too close to it. Like if their ear got too close, they'd feel a little weird. So just something interesting that I will just keep thinking about. And I don't really know how to explore that in a formulaic way, but a lot of my practice up until now, especially with the sound, has been very intuitive and very just like do something and then react and then do something else and then react. So that's kind of where I'm gonna keep going for now. And so that piece was the centerpiece of a larger exhibition that I was able to do in 2021 that was called Between Sound and Silence, and it was just kind of a spread of all of those experiments that I had done thus far. So you can see the foil piece right there. In this condition, which this was a surprise, the foil piece actually ended up ripping over the course of about a month. The vibrations just fractured the foil ever so slightly, and it started tearing, and then one day I went to the gallery and it was just loose, and the bottom was still moving and the top was just hanging. And I thought, like, I don't know, that's really cool and a little poetic. I don't know what the poem would be, I'm not a writer. But something, again, I want to explore, like how could you use sound waves to like break something, just as you can use it to make something beautiful. And this was the other half of the show, the first instance of pools. And then, so I'm flash forwarding a little bit just due to time, but this was my next attempt at a large scale sound installation. I was interested in the idea of reflectivity, so I started playing with mylar, which is like a chromy, highly reflective plastic. And I set up this experiment with 2 speakers and a sheet of mylar on either side, and I wanted to kind of see if there would be maybe an affinity-like effect, but warped through the sound waves. So, and I didn't really think about it at the time, but this was one of the first times I started bringing light into the equation in a big way, and kind of like, how can sound and light and reflection all start to play together? So that test went well, so I knew I had to make a bigger test. So I set up this big 2x4 frame in my studio. I put big sheets of mylar on it and ran speaker vibrations through it. And this was the moment, like another one of those breakthrough moments where I was like, all right, this can be a big thing. I'm gonna go for it. I'm gonna like build the big room out of the mylar. So more assembly drawings and install plans. I work at an architecture college, so I've picked up some drawing conventions from them. And then this was the first version of the portal piece at Currents in 2023. It was exciting to see because I did not know how it was going to look or feel or behave because it was so big I couldn't like put it together in my studio other than that test. And so this is kind of how it behaved. It had these fabric panels on the outside that kind of contained all the light into that little box, partially to play nice with all the other Currents pieces, but it also created this really like specific environment, which was really exciting to me because you know, a big interest in my practice is like sensory experience and how do we all kind of show up in the world. What is that perception? How does that, you know, define what we think and reality and meaning? And so having this space, having the portal finally feel like a portal, I was super happy. I made the piece again, our second version. So again, it's all a big kind of feedback loop where one piece just leads to the next. And in this version, I was very intentional to not put those fabric panels on the outside. I wanted to kind of have that A to B comparison of like, once the piece is open and all the light can escape, how is that portal gonna feel? And so this was the result. It just kind of turned the piece inside out literally and brought that kind of, the light play and the movement and this like sense of watery sound and space, it brought it to all dimensions of the piece. So I was really happy with the second version. I would say I like it better. I don't know if I can like one better because I wouldn't have made this if I hadn't made the first one, but I was super happy with this open version. I mean, everything behaves the same, everything kind of, it's the same piece in all essence, but it's opened up and the energy can kind of go out instead of be kept kind of contained in a little box. And also I was really happy that the light reflections and waves and movement could kind of spill all across the space and bring the whole space into part of that sonic and sensory experience. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about Mirage as well. And as we've talked about our lighting and our programming and how that kind of spoke to this idea of like reactivity and how the Mirage is just that. It's kind of a mirage of maybe even the current times and like what's happening in the world. There's a lot of elements of chaos to it and how it's just being swayed by everything. And so I'll take you, I'm at 20 minutes, so I'll go quickly through this, but I'll take you through just like the testing and the construction side of this. Because that was, well, it was a true collaboration. We played to our strengths. So we did some tests with this material called bird scare tape, and it is used in agricultural applications to literally scare birds from crops. And I think I had a roll and I showed it to you, and we were just like, let's start playing with this. Let's do something with it, because we knew we had to do a light-focused piece. And so we did that test in the studio, and we thought, all right, there's something there again, so let's go forward. And this was the building. We took measurements, we did a site visit, we kind of got all the information we could, and then I went to Rhino and created a one-to-one model of that space so we could be sure we were scaling the piece properly. And not only that, but it had to be suspended and mounted to the ledges with cables, and all that had to be like perfect, or else, you know, we were putting like a bunch of metal above people's heads and it wasn't gonna be safe. So, in order to design the piece, we hired a UNM architecture student with part of our grant money to write us a Grasshopper script, and that script enabled us to use math and use kind of predetermined building data to start generating different forms for Mirage and different configurations that these panels could get into. So we had lots and lots and lots of versions. I don't even know how many, like hundreds, but we finally landed on one which looked like this, and every single element in the piece had to be modeled by hand down to like each one of those connection points. Those were the 3D printed brackets that connected pieces of aluminum tubing, and then that's how the whole structure was created. So this was how it looked in Rhino before assembly day, some of our assembly drawings, and then here's us actually in the studio putting that big frame together. It was so big that like it couldn't even fit out of the garage door without like 3 people and like twisting it up. It's a wonder we were able to drive it across town on the trailer, but we got it safely somehow. And then here is another studio time lapse of us putting that tape on. So we decided to do everything that we possibly could ahead of time, because once we were up on 2 scissor lifts, it was going to be really hard to like do detail work. Here is a couple of those light tests, and Zuvya talked about how Zuvya programmed those, because again, not my wheelhouse. But the light test was really fun. That's when it started to feel real. We were like, this is gonna be awesome. And then here's us on install day, the massive piece on the trailer, which was ridiculous to drive across town. I just thought, if this falls, this is gonna be crazy. And yeah, we're excited to figure out like maybe where this collaborative practice might go and what the next thing may be. And then here's just a final shot of that piece with the lowrider in the front, because it was Sunday. And that is all I got. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alyce Santoro. I am a conceptual artist. That's my work in the corner. I'm going to give you a little background before I launch. I was a scientist. In high school, I knew that I wanted to combine art and science. I wanted to make art about the wonder part of science, the miracles and nature, and how amazing I felt it was. So I decided that there wasn't like interdisciplinary studies in the 1980s, so I had to make up my own program. So I decided to go to a school, which was Southampton College on the end of Long Island, that had a marine biology program, but they also had a scientific illustration program. So I thought that would be the way to go, is like become a scientific illustrator, but I also wanted to be a good scientist. I didn't want to presume that I could make art about something I didn't understand. Also, I too felt like I was a right brain person, but I felt like instead of just doing the normal thing, which would be like, I'm just gonna go with that, I decided I needed to hone the left-hand side. So I was in the tutor for calculus every single day. Like I It was a very heavy physics. I love physics. It was a very heavy physics curriculum and chemistry, and I got through it. And I learned so much. And it was the miracle part. Southampton College was wonderful for that because it wasn't a research place. It was really just the professors were really teaching us field biology. I spent a semester at sea. I spent a semester in Fiji diving on reefs and learning about sea urchins and doing my own experiments. And so when I graduated, well, let me say one more thing. So as an undergrad, I had an internship at UC Santa Cruz studying marine mammal bioacoustics. I was interested in physics and the physics of sound, and I'm a flute player too. I'll get to that in a second. I learned when I got there, when I arrived for the internship, that the project was funded by the Office of Naval Research. And I didn't want to be part of that. I didn't want to be part of taking a marine mammal and making better sonar for weapons. But I stayed for the semester to learn from these scientists. Ken Norris, I don't know if anyone knows of Ken Norris, he's one of the world's leading marine mammal bioacoustics. He's long gone, but he was there, and I felt like I could have a lot to learn, and I did learn a lot. But I also learned that I didn't want my research to be funded by something nefarious. So when I graduated, I went immediately to Rhode Island School of Design. They had a scientific illustration certificate program, not an MFA program, a certificate program. It was cheap. It was not, I didn't have to pay for a full master's, and I could work during the day. It was a night school program. It took 4 years to complete. It was amazing. It was all of the RISD professors. I mean, I got a full-fledged RISD education, but I just did it at night, while I worked during the day as a marine biologist. So I lived in loft spaces in Providence, Rhode Island, and I commuted to the campus of the University of Rhode Island. I worked on a couple different projects. The first project was a salmon aquaculture project. So my job was to make food for the salmon, and then take each salmon after I had nurtured them. I'm Italian, and so I took my job very seriously. I was putting carnitine. The research was about trying to see if these fish would develop a fatty liver or if a higher protein liver, if they were fed a feed that had carnitine in it. So after I fed them the food and they grew, I had to kill them, each little one by themselves. I would hold the fish like this and then crack its skull, and then I would dissect it, take out its liver, and blend it up in a blender and run assays on it to find out how the fat content of the liver. So I learned from that experiment that I got very attached to my experimental creatures. Especially there was another creature in another lab that I got very attached to, which was a flounder. This is from like the early 90s. What was happening in this lab is that these flounder were being born, and then as they were developing, the eyes moved to the upper side of the body, but no one could explain why that happens. Like, I kept on asking everybody, by day 33, they're already looking like a flatfish, but nobody could tell me how this was happening or why. It's probably an endocrine thing. I mean, it's not completely unknown, but it's born as a normal fish with eyes on either side of its head, and it starts swimming sideways, and the eyes migrate up to the top of the head. I was fascinated by this, and so I drew this image, and I started making illustrations for the scientists. I wasn't making it, I thought I was going to make scientific illustrations for lay people, but I ended up making scientific illustrations for the scientists themselves. I'm going to get you over to, I have so many things I really would love to talk with you about, but I'm going to have to limit it. Let's see here. So that's under writing. This is my website, so if there's anything you're interested in, just go on over here. And so this is one of the first prints I ever made. 92% junk according to science. So at the time, this was like the 90s, the Human Genome Project was going on, and we were just about to get to the point where they were going to give us the punchline, like what was going to happen with the human genome. And I was like, 92% junk, that seems pretty presumptuous. Like, why shouldn't we go 92%, we're not sure? Or like, maybe we'll figure it out later, DNA or something. I was just really taken by this. And so I hung this in the lab where I was working. I mean, I wasn't making art for lay people, I was making art for scientists. And so, so I realized that I was branching off. I realized at a certain point, okay, so the next project I worked on, meanwhile, I'm still going to RISD at night. I started working on this project. It was called Global Change back in the late 90s. It was a seagoing oceanographic research project. I spent 3 months of the year floating around Georges Bank in the North Atlantic, collecting zooplankton. I would bring the zooplankton back to the lab and count it. And over the course of time, I did this job for several years. Mostly we were going out into the North Atlantic in the middle of the winter, steaming around to these, latitude and longitude in the middle of the ocean. It was freezing cold. Put my dry suit on at 3 o'clock in the morning and do my shift. Anyway, what we were seeing over the course of years is that there were fewer larval fish and that the oceans were warming and that the oceans were acidifying. I was on these boats with other scientists from all over the world. The project was called Global Ocean Ecosystem Dynamics. And we were going out of Woods Hole, or out of the University of Rhode Island, and I was working for the University of Rhode Island, but with scientists from all over the world who had different specialties. So I was talking to scientists from all over the world. And we were all seeing the same thing. And I was saying, shouldn't we say something? I mean, there's fewer larval fish and the oceans are warming and the oceans are acidifying. And they said, well, no, we need 20 years of data. I mean, this data is going to take 20 years to analyze. And they were right. If I had been, to be a good scientist, you have to be detached, you have to be objective. But I was not. I was extremely passionate about the problem. And I realized that as an artist, as a scientific illustrator, I could say things, but I could not say as a scientist. And so at some point, by default, I had to stop being a scientist because I knew that I couldn't be a good one. So I finished the RISD program. I illustrated one textbook for Anne Fausto Sterling. I should have put a slide up. She wrote 25 years ago a book about human sexuality called Sexing the Body, and I had to draw about 100 illustrations of intersex genitalia and slices of the brain, and it was fascinating because her theory, Anne Fausto Sterling's theory, is that there are 5 genders. There's true hermaphrodite, and then there's, if you have XX, and male genitalia, or female, you have XY, and the opposite. Anyway, Anne Fausto Sterling is now, she's a classic. Like, that book has become a classic. So that was the one book that I illustrated. As I was sort of leaving science to become a philosopher of science and a critic in some ways of certain aspects of science, which I'm going to get to. Okay, so let's get back to the work that's on the wall. So the first thing that you may have seen is the flame tube. My work's extremely low tech. So this was the late 90s. I had a friend who was a physics professor, and she showed me that she had a Rubens tube. She was using it with a frequency generator, and I thought, I want to hook my flute up to that. So I built a Rubens tube, and I hooked it up to the gas line in my studio. And I just invited friends over to experiment with it. So basically all it is it's a long metal tube with hundreds of holes drilled in the top, and you put a balloon or a membrane on one end. I didn't set the timer, so if someone could tell me what time it is. There's a balloon on one end. I put an amplifier up to the balloon. I play the flute with an octave pedal through the amplifier. Here, I can show you, I'm going to show you not the one that's in the gallery, I'm going to show you one that I did in 2006. Because you'll never find it on YouTube. So it's sort of just like a fun thing to just show you a little tiny piece of this. So this is early, this is 2006. I was doing this before there was YouTube, so I don't have any documentation of that, but so you sort of get the idea. The gas inside the tube vibrates with the sound. Sound causes pressure. And I was just fascinated that I could improvise with the flames, which turned out to be improvising like a person, because all of a sudden the flames are doing something really interesting, and I want to keep doing that. And so I keep trying to figure out what's going to make the tube happy. And so it's a fun little thing, but it's very low tech. I was very interested in cymatics and in Hans Jenny and the vibration, the sand on the side of a plate with the violin bow. I mean, this idea that vibration really is at the heart of all things, right? So at the same time, I was working on my sonic fabric project, which is the next thing in the over there. Okay, this page on my website, Projects for Prepared Ear. It's a whole page of sound-related art. So if you're interested, I'm just going to skip it. So sonic fabric. So sonic fabric is a textile that's woven from cassette tape. It is, okay, when I was a kid, I raced small sailboats on a lake in northern New Jersey. My dad would use small strands of cassette tape to tell the direction of the wind, because small strands of cassette tape are durable and they are very sensitive to the wind. And I used to imagine that I could hear the Beatles or Cat Stevens or John Coltrane or whatever my dad had recorded onto the tape. I imagined that if the wind hit it just right, it would waft out into the wind. So years and years later, I was at UC Santa Cruz for the bioacoustics project, and I met Tibetan Buddhists for the first time. And they had prayer flags. And the idea behind the prayer flags is that they have mantras or sacred syllables that are silk screened onto the flag. And the idea is that when the wind hits it, it wafts out into the wind. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be fantastic if I could weave an actual fabric that had sounds on it, and it would be dual purpose. It would waft out into the wind. So I set about collecting tapes. I carried a tape recorder, like a literal tape recorder, with me for years and years and years, and collected samples of sounds. So I had samples of all kinds of things. And the first edition of fabric was woven with 100 individual tapes. Some were my broken tapes from my high school band. I had an electric pickup put in my flute when I was in high school because I was inspired by Laurie Anderson's tape bow violin. So I had an electric flute for, from the beginning. So there's probably something about the tape. I used hundreds and hundreds of tape with my punk band recordings. So anyway, the first edition of fabric, this is it right here, was made with 100 individual tapes. And if you look really closely at it, you can see there's certain like blue or yellow leader, and I know exactly what those tapes were. So I wove some more fabric, and I moved to New York, and I went to Louise Bourgeois' studio, because at the time Louise would invite you to come to her studio. And I brought my 2 yards of fabric, and Louise said, what does it do? And I said, it's for rituals. And she said, well, then do a ritual. And so I had everybody put their sacred objects on there, and we blessed it with bourbon because everybody was drinking. I mean, I brought chocolate chip cookies, everyone else brought booze. Like, I didn't know that's what you were supposed to bring. Anyway, so another guy at Louise Bourgeois' studio, who was a fellow artist, said, you know what, it's probably still magnetic. Like, we should run a tape head over it. So we went to the nearest thrift store and we bought an old Walkman and just moved the head. This is like very early circuit bending. I'm not like you guys, are off the charts.
We're not like you.
So I got a tape head, pressed the button, and sure enough, the cell phone's gonna make it, the computer's gonna make it noisy. But so it's too much static feedback. We can do it after. But it does, it makes a sound, and I can tell the different editions apart by the sound. So I make editions of this fabric. They all are recorded with different, the first batch was my own favorite stuff. The second batch was The Sounds of New York City. Between Stations is the name of the album, and you can listen to the album. I moved to New York right after 9/11, and everything seemed really precious. I was in the subway with my tape recorder, recording kids going to school, and musicians that were in the subway, and just conversations. And I called the album Between Stations because sometimes, I don't know if anyone lived in New York after 9/11, but you'd be in the subway and you'd be between the stations and the lights would go out. And you just think, okay, well maybe I'm just gonna die here in this car with all these other people, and that's it, I'm done. So that's what it was called, Between Stations. But it's an album of sound collages. This was the first time I really made it listenable. My point was only to put as much sound as I could in the fabric, because to me there was a quantum physics element of this. I mean, at the most basic level, everything is made up of vibration. And I wanted this fabric to be literally an exquisite cacophony. I wanted to put Tibetan monks and the call to prayer, and I wanted to put John Coltrane, and I wanted to put everything in the world together and make it a fabric of us all. That this is what it really is. So there are editions. So Between Stations is the New York City edition. I did an edition. This one was with students in the Galician region of Spain, northwestern Spain. Their language and music was suppressed during the Franco years, and they commissioned me to come over and work with them to make an edition of Fabric recorded with their sounds and their language, and it was amazing. And then the students from the University of Vigo made these garments based on their traditional dress. This sale was exhibited, it was a solo show in Chelsea. Right after this gallery had been flooded during Hurricane Sandy, that gallery is like below ground, and it had been filled halfway up with water. And they wanted me to make a sale. Well, I mean, I make sales, but they wanted me to make a sale for their reopening after Hurricane Sandy. So this is recorded with the Between Stations edition. And to me, sailing, growing up sailing, I was always, you're always looking up, and it's very much like a cathedral window. It's very much like a spiritual practice. You're constantly adjusting the sails and paying very close attention to the wind and the waves on the water. So the striped edition, the pattern is, the thread is warp. The warp thread is polyester or cotton. The weft is the tape. So this one is brown tape and black thread. This one is colored thread and black tape. And I had made a set of sailboat sails out of it. But each color represents a musical note, which led years later, this was my pandemic project, was, let's see, it was right here, tonal relativity. So I took, this is not in the gallery, and I'll run through it very fast. 12 notes in a Western chromatic scale, 12 colors in a tertiary color wheel. So if you were to relate each note to a color, then all of a sudden you could hear intervals. And I don't know if we have musicians here, but for example, this is a set of modes. And if you've ever tried to learn jazz, you will have to learn all these modes. Western music is a lot, it's major key and minor key, but there's other parts of the world and other cultures that use all kinds of other scales, and I wanted to embed these scales in my being so that when I improvise, I'm not just defaulting to the same thing. I want to think differently. I think we all need to think differently, and I think listening to the same chords and the same scales all the time is not good for our brain. I want to branch out. So I started out by just mapping the original set of modes, which is a whole step, a half step, 3 whole steps, and a half step. It turns out that when I mapped the first set of modes, it's the same intervals, whole, half. They're just moving around. So I only needed to learn one scale. But if you started on a different note, like Phrygian, you probably all know Phrygian, that's like flamenco. It starts on a half step. That's what makes it sound like that. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on this one because it's not here. I'm going to go to the next one, which is the earth, down to earth. So I started making these collages where I'm always putting the earth from space on the earth, because it's really the only perspective we have is we live on a planet, we're not going anywhere, we live here, it's our home, and I want to always remember that our perspective is earth from earth. So I'm just going to read what this says here at the bottom of the page. The famed 1972 blue marble photograph of planet Earth taken from the Apollo 17 spacecraft by NASA astronaut and notorious anti-environmentalist, I want to make sure everyone knows that, Harrison Schmitt, he's a paid shill, as seen from space, offered a breathtaking perspective on our miraculously life-supporting and ultimately minuscule shared home. At the same time, it heralded an age in which humans were no longer inextricably bound to Earth. Leaving suddenly seemed like a viable, even for some desirable, possibility. The farthest reaches of the universe became open to study and exploration, as well as extraction and colonization. In a 2013 interview, author, cultural critic Naomi Klein expressed a similar view when she expressed the need for a re-examination of the astronaut's eye worldview, which has governed the big green environmental movement for so long. The time has come to let go of the icon of the globe because it places us above it and has allowed us to see nature in this really abstracted way and sort of move pieces like pieces on a chessboard and really lose touch with the earth. Half a century since the blue marble image was captured, billionaires are pushing luxury rocket rides and claiming that upon the collapse of terrestrial ecosystems, hastened by the actions/enterprises of said billionaires, colonies on the moon or Mars are the next, or only, and I added only after we listened to Miriam's talk, because she had a slide that had Stephen Hawking saying that there are only 2 choices, leave Earth or go extinct. There was no third choice. The third choice is to put all those resources that we're currently pouring into going to other planets into making this planet sustainable for everyone. So there's a video that goes with this here, and I really would love for everyone to watch it. It's got a soundtrack, a flute duo, myself and a friend, playing a piece by a Mexican composer, Mario Lavista. It's slowed to half speed, so it's very eerie and strange. But I just want to say that there's this organization called Science for the People, and it started during the Vietnam War era, and they've recently become active again. And I just want to urge everybody, because I feel like we as scientists, as artists who are interested in science, we have an opportunity right now to make art that amplifies the things we want it to amplify. We don't want to amplify Elon Musk. We don't. We want to think very critically and carefully about what we're amplifying. And I want to just say one more thing. Science has to be objective. To be a good scientist, you have to be cold and detached. It's not a real stance, it's just the stance you have to take. You have to put controls into your experiment to make sure that your personal biases are not in it. But as artists, we don't have to do that. And I feel like that is why the environmental movement has failed so miserably, because 350 is a number. And we have been revering science since, Descartes. I mean, science is the way that we have come to understand the world, but we can never forget that science can give us the data that's telling us that we only have 20 more years of crops until it fails, but it's artists who are going to move people, to be able to move people to action. And I wrote a thesis about it. I have no more time, but this is a thesis that I wrote in 2020, right before the pandemic, about it's called An Intricate Ensemble, the Art Science of an Ecological Imaginary for the Anthropocene Epoch. And it's free to download from my website. And if anyone is interested in this, I would love to talk with you about it. And I feel like we should start an organization called, Sci-Art for the People, because we have a great opportunity here. And I feel like we need to be really critical about what we amplify. That's all I want to say.
And what's your website?
It's my name, AlyceSantoro.com. I have some I call my work philosophoprops, because a lot of times I use, like this, I use it to demonstrate something. So there's other philosophoprops there that I'm not getting to. But I have some manifestos, which has my website address on it. I have a card if you want a card. Anyway, I think we can talk about more stuff later. Thank you. I'm sorry I took up so much time.
Three of you, it's so interesting the different perspectives of sound that you're all three working with. Like, for me, Alyce, it's once you told that story about you didn't even try to play the fabric, that it was really about like looking at those two pieces about memory, the stories that are going inside and the ritual, but then the fascination that actually you can play it makes it super cool. And these remind me of Joseph Cornell, like his memory boxes. Interesting to see and hear about like what's next for all three of you. Knowing Kirsten, the experimentation that you've been doing with cymatics and the beautiful visualization of the materials is really impressive, taking it a step further, because we've seen those cymatic videos and we could look at them for hours, but the fact that you made these bands is really interesting. And also thinking about the different frequencies, like for other people that may not know about the frequencies and how it affects your body, like how some people were repelled by them because physically we have weaponized frequencies, right? It actually does disturb the organs in the body. So it'd be interesting to hear like what's next with the frequencies. And love your visualizations, how you did a whole full circle. That was really great to like go from the physical, the virtual, and back to the physical. I really love that. It reminded me of your piece, Andrea, this piece here. Yeah.
Comments, what's next?
You guys said too much.
I guess just exploring more and trying to figure out more. I feel like I'm really at the beginning of like the heat explorations and thinking about like energy as like a sculptural medium. So just playing around with different forms, different shapes, different technologies, or how to create that sensation, that physical sensation that people can interact with. And yeah, moving the way I did this installation, where I'm moving away from the visual light projection. I think that's definitely what I want to try to focus on more and see if I can get people engaged even without that visual representation.
Thank you so much for your question. I'd love to maybe get your card and pick your brain about sound healing. That's like something I want to research more, and as I get more into that like emotional side of the work, or the potential for the emotional connection. So to answer your question, I'll share two things that I've been thinking about. And both, kind of where my brain's going next is like, how do I put a little bit of personal narrative into these works? Thinking about how I grew up, growing up in a super conservative environment as like a very like different person that did not fit the mold at all, and ended up like leaving my home at age 18, and it was like, you know, a really like crazy journey. And so part of what I want to do with the sound is like tap back into some of these sounds of maybe even my upbringing, some of this like ability for sound to create meaning in like a church sense or in a spirituality sense, and put that into new installations. So I've thought of the idea of a veil, and rather than opaque materials and flag tape, like could I create a suspended veil, but that's like floating with sound waves, like, and more science, more research, but like, can I create a standing wave that allows something to levitate? I've looked up levitation, but usually they're levitating like little styrofoam balls with sound waves. So is it possible to safely do that bigger? So that's one thing that I think is next, and more research to be done.
I'm working again with junk DNA, because now there's so much research on what it does. You know, it's not junk at all. It codes for all sorts of things. And so I'm really interested in projects that do demonstrate kind of that other wonder part. And you know, we're in the land of enchantment, so I feel like we can focus on the enchanted things. And so a lot of people mention that during their talks. And anyway, I'm also building instruments. I've been making flutes out of clay that I've been harvesting from my land, and making more. I really enjoy making the video coupled with sound. I feel like it creates an atmosphere, it creates a feeling, and I'm really interested in that.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, we're going to have to wrap up. We're limited on time in here, but thank you again for the